From all your waters, America, I choose the river with the magical name, Monongahela. For the river has a tale to tell, even deeper and longer than it is. Over homesteads, humpbacked houses, there remains still the pall of gun smoke, writing the story of the awaited massacre. And the sooty smokestacks of Carnegie will not cover the writing of the gunsmoke, as long as the Monongahela River tells this story to its banks.
At the beginning of 1892, the people of Homestead, Pennsylvania, had no idea of the upheaval that was about to transform their lives. They had built a proud and prosperous community upriver from Pittsburgh. In just 10 years, 12,000 men, women, and children had settled around the Carnegie Steelworks. They were setting records in the production of armor plate and structural steel, and transforming America in the process.
The past and present are known, and the record fills every homesteader with pride. What of the future? It is full of promise. Flanked by the greatest industrial city of the Union, with splendid railroad and water facilities, having the most extensive and varied steel mills in the country, the future growth of Homestead will undoubtedly be more rapid than its past, and before another decade, it will be the largest town in western Pennsylvania.
By the end of 1892, Homestead would be known throughout the world, but not for the reasons its boosters had hoped. A fierce conflict would erupt that summer, pitting the country's most powerful labor union against its largest steelmaker. The workers' right to organize hung in the balance. The outcome would shape their lives for generations to come. In the wake of the Civil War, an industrial revolution swept across America. Manufacturing flourished, and daring entrepreneurs became rich, very rich. But for the average factory worker, the revolution meant endless drudgery, long hours, and dangerous work.
April 2nd, 1892. The history of the Homestead Steelworks is marked with a large number of frightful accidents. That of last Saturday, wherein one man lost his life and 7 others received serious injuries, was scarcely less terrible. Molten metal came in contact with moisture, resulting in a terrific explosion, some of it striking the opposite wall 70 feet away.
Where machines were present, death and injury were commonplace. A single slip could cost a man his life. A widow was lucky if the company picked up the cost of the funeral. Children worked, some falling victim to indifferent machines. Even 3-year-olds sometimes spent 12-hour shifts at their mother's sides. Sooty streets, open sewers, and foul air were the trademarks of many factory towns. Workers often depended on the company for housing and owed their pay to company-run stores. Homestead was radically different. Work in the mill was just as hazardous, but steelworkers had built a powerful union which gave them a say in hiring, wages, and how jobs were done. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had 800 members in Homestead, all skilled craftsmen. Workers' organizations, not the company, dominated civic life. Many homesteaders owned their own houses, Their taxes were bringing lights and sidewalks to city streets. Decent pay allowed their children to attend school, and reasonable hours in the mill left them time to run the local government.
The Constitution of this country guarantees all men the right to live. But in order to live, we must keep up a continuous struggle.
Homestead's elected leader was a union man, John McLuckie. He had been active in labor politics since his days as a Pennsylvania coal miner. He believed that every working man should be able to feed and house his family. McLuckie could be counted on to stick to his principles. He got his first job in steel in nearby Braddock. His employer was Andrew Carnegie, the man he would face in a bitter confrontation in 1892. Carnegie was a poor weaver's son when he left his native Scotland in 1848. By the 1880s, he had become one of America's leading industrialists. He was among the first iron manufacturers in the country to invest in steel. A stronger and more flexible metal than iron, steel proved highly profitable. It was rapidly replacing iron in railroad, bridge, and skyscraper construction, and revolutionary new technologies made it easier to produce. The iron industry relied on highly skilled, unionized craftsmen. Far fewer skilled men were needed to make steel. This left the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers vulnerable, and opened the way for steel manufacturers to seize control of the shop floor. In mill after mill, workers fought back, but few succeeded. When the original owners of the Homestead Mill tried to impose a non-union contract in 1882, Homestead's workers accused them of instituting a new form of slavery.
To the editors, National Labor Tribune. Just think of it, fellow workmen, living in a land where not 20 years ago we had a war against slavery, in a land where freedom and independence was proclaimed, that we would go on in our right minds and sober senses and sign away our rights as free-born American citizens.
The message of the Homestead workers resonated up and down the Monongahela River Valley, and Homestead won its fight to remain a union mill. A year later, Andrew Carnegie purchased the Homestead Works and became America's biggest steel producer. With his working-class roots and his public statements on the rights of labor, Carnegie seemed just the man to oversee Homestead's workforce.
The right of the working man to combine and to form trades unions is no less sacred than the right of the manufacturer to enter into associations and conferences with his fellows, and it must sooner or later be conceded.
Carnegie made a commitment to use his wealth to improve the lives of his workers. He built libraries, schools, and concert halls, costing huge sums of money. To acquire this wealth, Carnegie increasingly focused on the bottom line. He began by eliminating most of his industrial competition. Then he drove the unions out of his mills. When unionized workers refused to yield, he hired armed guards to bring in non-union replacements. Homestead alone withstood Carnegie's assaults. In 1889, its powerful union forced the company to negotiate a 3-year contract after thousands of homesteaders confronted county deputies trying to bring non-union workers into town. As the end of that contract approached in 1892, Carnegie was determined to assert his rights and gain absolute control over the mill. From his home in New York City, he drafted a notice to the Homestead workers.
There has been forced upon this firm the question whether its works are to be run union or non-union. As the vast majority of our employees are non-union, the firm has decided that the minority must give way to the majority. These works, therefore, will be necessarily non-union after the expiration of the present agreement.
Carnegie sent the notice to the company's officers in Pittsburgh, but they never showed it to the Homestead workers. Instead, they urged Carnegie to take his annual vacation in Scotland and leave the matter to the company chairman, Henry Clay Frick. Frick was a brilliant entrepreneur. He made his fortune by buying up the region's best coal fields and by building over 1,000 ovens that turned coal into coke, an essential fuel for making steel. The Carnegie Company was Frick's biggest client, and in 1882 they negotiated a substantial interest in each other's firms. Frick was an uncompromising foe of organized labor, determined to increase profits. Carnegie chose him to run the new concern.
Frick had smashed the unions in his coke ovens at Connellsville, and some people said he meant to do a similar job in Homestead. While negotiations were still ostensibly in progress, Frick had a tall fence built around the mill and erected searchlight platforms around the mill yard. The union men promptly nicknamed the mill Fort Frick. A group of carpenters working on the fence heard a rougher call to one of them. "Do a good job on that fence, Charlie." The carpenter replied, "Ain't it a hell of a note? Like asking a man to dig his own grave."
The great convention of the Amalgamated Association opens today. It is beyond question the most powerful independent labor organization in the world, and every movement of the manufacturers seems to aim at its destruction in the coming conflict.
Homestead's unionized workers were given an ultimatum: sign the company's contract by June 24th, or work in the mill on a non-union basis.
The eyes of the whole world of labor are at present fixed on Homestead. You are entering on a struggle for your rights. If you succeed, the labor of this great country will profit by your success. If you fail, success on their part will be all the harder to gain.
John McLucky took the floor.
The reduction of wages proposed by Mr. Frick means that we will receive from 12 to 42% less. This would mean a cessation of public improvements in Homestead, a material reduction of the prosperity of the town, and in a great many cases, individual hardship. We are asking nothing but our rights, and we will have them if it requires force to get them.
On June 24th, negotiations deadlocked. The following day, Frick wrote a letter to Robert Pinkerton, head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
We will want 300 guards for service at our Homestead mills as a measure of precaution against interference with our plan to start the operation of the works again on July 6, 1892.
The Pinkerton Agency was the most effective strike-breaking force in the country. By 1892, Pinkertons had used spies and armed guards to end over 70 labor disputes. So flagrant was their disregard for human life that 11 states had outlawed their employment. Working people feared and despised them. On June 28th, the Carnegie Company shut down the open hearth furnace and the armor plate mill, locking out 800 men. The next morning, the Amalgamated called a mass meeting. Most of the 3,000 who attended were not skilled workers. They didn't belong to the union, but all agreed to stand firm with the locked-out men. Soon they would have little choice. During the meeting, the company shut the mill down, laying off the entire workforce. Within days, 600 of the foreign-born workers formed their own lodge of the Amalgamated. By 1892, Homestead had become home to an international working class. The expanding mill drew Slovaks, Poles, and other Eastern Europeans, just as it had their British, Irish, and German co-workers. Despite the anti-immigrant sentiments which prevailed in western Pennsylvania, skilled and unskilled, union and non-union, native and foreign-born workers cast their lot together to succeed or fail as one. The Amalgamated appointed an advisory committee to direct the workmen's actions during the lockout. For their spokesman, they chose a charismatic young leader, Hugh O'Donnell.
The committee has decided to organize their forces on a truly military basis. We will be in touch with every city and hamlet in the United States, and will hear the moment a train of men for the mill leaves other cities.
Newspaper reporters and sketch artists converged on Homestead to see if the nation's largest steelmaker and its most militant labor union would come to blows.
The locked-out men are on picket duty at every possible point of entrance to the works. The country is thoroughly picketed and patrolled for 4 miles in every direction. No stranger is allowed to remain in town until his credentials have been proved satisfactory.
We do not propose that Andrew Carnegie's representatives shall bulldoze us. We have our homes in this town, our churches, our societies, and our cemeteries. We are bound to Homestead by all the ties that men hold dearest and most sacred. The Carnegie Company has imported men of all nationalities in places that are east of us, and west of us, and south of us. They never have imported a man into Homestead, and by God, they never will.
A suppressed volcano exists among the American workmen. And someday, there will be an uprising that will become history.
The Reverend J.J. McIllier was Homestead's Methodist minister.
The question is often asked, where would Homestead be without the mills? Why not ask, where would Andrew Carnegie be without the millions he has made from the mills? Capitalists should remember that men do not sell their self-respect when they sell their labor.
Even Ivy Leaguers absorbed in the weekend's Yale-Harvard race followed the events with increasing alarm. 1892 was a presidential election year, and Homestead posed a threat to the incumbent Republican Party. The Republican platform centered around a high tariff policy, supported by both business and labor. If the dispute at Homestead could not be settled to the workers' satisfaction, the party risked losing labor's vote.
July 2nd to the New York Times. The Carnegie Steel Company gave formal notice today that the Homestead Mill is to be operated as a non-union plant. The secretary said, any of our old employees may return to work, but they must make application as individuals. All who do not apply will be considered not to desire work, and their places will be filled by new men.
On the 4th of July, Frick sent a coded cable to Carnegie regarding plunge, their code word for Homestead.
Small pond pony plunge, repairing pond pony choke, watchman arrive, plunge morning, board early.
The following day, Frick sent a message to the Allegheny County Jail. He asked the sheriff to send 100 deputies to Homestead to secure the mill for non-union workers. The sheriff feared this would cost him workers' votes. But Pittsburgh's political bosses pressured him to do Frick's bidding. He responded half-heartedly, leaving for Homestead with only 12 men. When the deputies arrived, the town appeared calm and the mill undamaged. The Amalgamated volunteered men to be sworn in as deputies, arguing that the Union had a strong interest in protecting the mill. The sheriff refused, knowing this was not what Frick had in mind. Under the circumstances, the advisory committee refused to be held responsible for the mill and formally disbanded. As the committee destroyed its records, the sheriff and his men retreated to Pittsburgh. Within hours, Frick would press ahead with his secret plan for the 6th of July. At 10 o'clock that night, Pinkerton guards from New York and Chicago boarded trains for Ohio. They continued to the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where they boarded barges bound for Homestead. 50 of the 300 men were Pinkerton regulars. Only the officers knew what lay ahead. At 2 a.m., men standing watch downriver spotted the barges as they entered the locks. One man set off on horseback to warn the townspeople, while the others telegraphed ahead.
Homestead, Pennsylvania, July 6, 1892. Like the trumpet of judgment blew the steam whistle of the electric light works. It was the signal for battle, murder, and sudden death. Not one of the thousands who heard and leaped from their beds to answer its signal dreamed of how much blood was to flow in response to its call. There was no method, no leadership apparent. It was the uprising of a population. Not men alone, but women too. Women armed with clubs as they joined the throng which streamed up the tracks, picking its way with a light-footedness born of long practice over the ties. The leader of the women, a white-haired old beldam who had seen 40 strikes in her long life, strode to the front and brandished the hand billy which she always keeps about her house for just such emergencies. Clear as a bell, far above the roar of the angry crowd, came the voice of Hugh O'Donnell as, hatless and coatless, he tried to check the angry men.
In God's name, my good fellows, keep back! Don't press down and force them to do murder!
But the crowd surged forward. Frick's wooden fortress crumbled like paper, and hundreds rushed onto the mill site to confront the Pinkertons at the company landing. A steelworker's son, Billy Foy, walked brazenly toward the tugboat. Standing on deck was the Pinkerton captain, Frederick Hinde.
Now, men, we are coming ashore to guard these works, and we want to come without bloodshed. There are 300 men behind me, and you cannot stop us.
Come on! And if you come over my carcass!
No one knows who fired first. One bullet struck Billy Foy, another Captain Hinde.
Then for the first time, the slouched hats took a hand. A row of rifles gleamed an instant from the side of the shoreward vessel, and in an instant more, a sheet of flame ran all along her clumsy hulk from stem to stern. Bad marksmanship has saved 100 lives here today.
Even so, the first volley proved deadly. 2 Pinkertons and 3 steelworkers lay mortally wounded. Dozens more were injured. O'Donnell escaped with only minor injury. A bullet grazed his thumb. But the first shots dashed his hopes of making peace. The show of force from the barges had released years of pent-up rage. Women and children were forced from the mill site, and the men prepared for battle. O'Donnell and the other strike leaders retreated to Amalgamated headquarters. With their captain down, the Pinkertons panicked. Despite the lull in the fighting, they made no move to seize the mill site. Instead, they placed Hinde and the other wounded guards on the tugboat Little Bill to be taken to a hospital in Braddock.
By the time that the Little Bill was underway for Braddock, the mill yard was a series of rifle pits. The bridge trestles and girders and heaps of scrap iron and half-open doors of the various mills and shops were filled with men skilled in the use of arms and bearing them in their hands. Not one of them, from the smooth-faced boys who seemed to prevail in numbers to huge, mustached old steelworkers who had drawn Carnegie's pay for half their lives, had any more compunction about killing a Pinkerton than they had about stamping on a mill rat. The sun rose gloriously, and from a distance the day was serene and quiet as a Sunday. Jack Morris stood up at the pumping station and looked out the window. A moment later, a Pinkerton ball pierced his forehead, and he fell headlong out of the window. And 40 feet below, his bones were broken on the shore.
Morris's companions carried him home to his widow. The sight of his shattered body sparked cries for revenge. Seeing the impossibility of controlling the situation, Sheriff McCleary wired Governor Pattison, requesting assistance from the state militia. Workers' votes had been crucial to Pattison's election, and he declined to intervene. By mid-morning, the strikers had witnessed so much blood, they were determined to make the Pinkertons pay. They fired an old Civil War cannon, then poured burning oil on the river, hoping to ignite the barges. The Pinkertons knew they couldn't hold out much longer.
We were penned in like rats. 4 times we put up a flag of truce, and 4 times it was shot away. The men were crazy with fright, crying like babies. Those in charge were the worst of the lot.
A tall, brawny workman waved 2 sticks of dynamite high above his head. Men of Homestead and fellow strikers, our brothers have been shot down before our eyes by hired thugs. Yonder in these boats are hundreds of men who have murdered our friends and would ravish our homes. Not one must escape alive. As he spoke, he flourished the dynamite. A score of men raised their clubs and followed him. They were not savages. They were good, strong men, wrought up by the sight of blood and ready to take the lives of those who threatened them and theirs.
At last, the amalgamated leaders returned to the battle site. O'Donnell urged the reluctant crowd to accept a Pinkerton surrender. They agreed, but only on the condition that the guards be turned over to the sheriff and charged with murder.
It was a relief to us when we saw a man coming down the banks holding up his hands to us. He told us that we had better give in, and we agreed with him. As soon as it was announced that we would surrender, the strikers came down upon us. They took our money, our traveling bags, and our watches, and then clubbed us. We were driven ashore on the march to the town with something horrible. We were clubbed at every step. Sticks, stones, and dirt were thrown at us. The women pulled us down, spat in our faces, kicked us, and tore our clothing off while the crowd jeered and cheered. Our dead and wounded were carried on litters, and they were maltreated as well as the rest of us. I don't know how we ever managed to climb that hill and get into the jail. But it was a relief when we finally reached there. More dead than alive.
After a decade of Pinkerton victories, ordinary people had finally evened the score. But 10 men lay dying, and the outcome of the strike was as uncertain as ever.
The forces of the 19th century are capital and labor. United, they transform the desert into a garden. In collision, they convert the garden into a waste.
There was no celebrating in Homestead the day after the battle. Everyone expected more Pinkertons to arrive. McLucky closed the saloons, and the townspeople remained armed and vigilant as they buried their dead. The slain men were laid to rest on the hill above town. Most of the laborers were placed in unmarked graves. Jack Morris had been a member of the International Order of Oddfellows. He was buried in the Society's plot. Reverend McIllier gave the eulogy.
This town has been bathed in blood and tears, and it was all brought on by that one man, Carnegie's manager. He was the only man with little enough blood to do it. There is no more sensibility in that man than there is in a toad. Of what use can combinations of capital and trust be without the broad shoulders and horny hands of the toilers? These are the bone and sinew of the land. These are they that make its wealth and give it its prosperity.
The county coroner's office listed another 6 workmen dead as a result of the battle. The last to die was George Rutter, a Civil War veteran and a long-time Union activist. At 46 years old, he had already outlived most of the steelworkers of his generation. There were 3 confirmed Pinkerton deaths, but the papers reported that a 4th man committed suicide as a result of his experiences on the 6th of July. The remaining guards escaped the Union's plan to have them charged with murder. The sheriff gave in to political pressure and put them on an eastbound train in the early morning hours of July 7th. Henry Clay Frick was conspicuously absent from the battle site. He remained in his office smoking cigars and refused to meet with the Amalgamated's president, who was ready to concede almost anything to stop the fighting. When Carnegie learned of the battle, he wired Frick from Scotland.
All anxiety gone since you stand firm. Never employ one of these rioters. Let grass grow over the works.
The events at Homestead prompted Congress to hold hearings. The Pinkerton Agency was already under investigation for its role in suppressing strikes nationwide. As Congress convened its hearings on Homestead, Pinkertons were battling workers once again in the Idaho mining town of Coeur d'Alene. Anti-tariff Democrats lambasted corporations for using hired guns to settle their labor disputes. One senator asserted that large companies should be looked upon as public entities, with the owners' rights subject to the rights of their workers. The iron and steel industry was outraged.
The issue has developed not into a question of wages, but into the recognition of a principle, whether the owner of works has a right to manage them himself, subject to the law. There is no greater or more arrogant tyrant than organized labor when it is powerful enough to enforce its decrees.
Labor came out to champion the Homestead strikers. Workmen rallied in Chicago and New York, and hundreds of dollars in donations poured in. $4,500 workers at Carnegie's mills in Pittsburgh, Duquesne, and Beaver Falls struck in sympathy with the locked-out men. At the best restaurant in Homestead, the cook and waitresses refused to serve suspected strikebreakers. They walked off the job when the town became so crowded they could no longer tell who was who. Andrew Carnegie confined himself to the remote fishing lodge he had rented for $2,000 a week. When the press finally located him, he had little to say.
I must positively decline to enter into any discussion of the case. The news grieved me more than I can tell you. It came upon me like a thunderbolt in a clear sky.
In New York City, two Russian anarchists had been following the news from Homestead. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman were certain that American workers were on the brink of revolution. They believed that violence was justified in the fight against exploitation. The events at Homestead were beckoning them to act on their beliefs. Just days after the battle, Berkman boarded a train for Pittsburgh. Goldman stayed behind.
His face bent low to mine, and he whispered, "Comrade, you will be with me to the last. You will proclaim that I gave what was dearest to me for an ideal, for the great, suffering people."
Berkman had only $15 in his pocket. Within the week, Goldman would wire him another $20 to purchase a new suit and a gun.
The country looks young and alluring in the early morning sunshine. But my thoughts are busy with Homestead. The removal of a tyrant is not merely justifiable, it is the highest duty of every revolutionist. Human life is indeed sacred and inviolate, but the killing of a tyrant, of an enemy of the people, is in no way to be considered as the taking of a life.
As Berkman's train sped toward Pittsburgh, an order flashed across the wires.
Put the division under arms and move at once, with ammunition, to the support of the Sheriff of Allegheny County at Homestead. Robert E. Patterson, Governor.
Pittsburgh's political bosses had been pressuring the governor. Given the sheriff's failure to gain control of the mill, Patterson agreed to call out the state militia. The amalgamated and the local government had continued to patrol the town and maintain order after the battle, even going so far as to repair Frick's fence. But they were not prepared for the arrival of troops.
You must show the world that you desire to maintain the peace, along with your rights. Welcome the soldiers. They are our friends.
Don't you believe it, man? They are coming here because that damn murderer Frick wants them. We have made the damn company rich, and now they send the soldiers here to shoot us down like the Pinkerton thugs have tried to.
There is a good deal of truth in what the brother before me said. I'm afraid it's bad to let them in. The blacklegs might be hiding in the rear. But then again, you can't stand up against them. They are not Pinkertons. And we can't fight the government of Pennsylvania.
The following morning, on July 12th, the entire community stood ready at the train station. They had prepared an elaborate welcome, hoping to convince the soldiers to defend their rights rather than the company's. Two hours later, General Snowden and 8,000 troops finally appeared, but not as expected. Avoiding the Homestead station, the soldiers debarked outside of town, marched in on foot, and immediately surrounded the mill. With the troops in town, the Carnegie Company was able to begin operations. Managers and clerks pitched in from the start. Bunkhouses and canteens were built for the new workforce. With few exceptions, former employees were not among the new hires.
Mr. Carnegie may be able to get non-union laborers, but without rollers, heaters, shearers, cutters, and other skilled workmen, the mills cannot start. And it is this class of men who will hold out to the last.
Contrary to O'Donnell's prediction, on July 15th, smoke could be seen rising from the Homestead mill for the first time since the lockout. Thanks to the mill's high degree of mechanization, the new unskilled workforce was producing steel. On July 23rd, Henry Clay Frick returned from lunch to finish off a routine day's work. Posing as an employment agent, Alexander Berkman had been trying to see him all morning. Outside Frick's office, the anarchist nervously paced the hall. By 2 o'clock, he could no longer stand the wait. He pushed his way into Frick's office and fired 2 shots.
Dead, I wonder? I must be sure. My eyes meet Frick's. His face is ashen gray. Blood is oozing from his neck. A strange feeling of shame comes over me. But the next moment I am filled with anger at this sentiment so unworthy of a revolutionist.
A crowd gathered as Berkman was restrained behind the second-story window. When the doctors arrived, Frick refused anesthesia in order to help them locate and remove the bullets. Then he signed some letters before leaving for home. The attempt on Frick's life shocked the nation. But the man himself remained unshaken.
I do not think I shall die. But whether I do or not, the company will pursue the same policy, and it will win.
3 cheers for the man who shot Frick!
Private W.L. Imes, a young militiaman stationed in Homestead, applauded Berkman's act. His commanding officer did not tolerate his candor. Imes was strung up by the thumbs until he lost consciousness, then drummed out of town with his head shaved. In a fashionable section of Pittsburgh, Frick lay in bed recovering from his wounds. Across the hall, Mrs. Frick lay convalescing as well. 2 days after the battle, she had given birth to a son. Neither mother nor child was well. Despite his doctor's orders to rest, Frick continued to attend to company business and to personally supervise the situation in Homestead. The Republican Party feared that the crisis would endanger President Harrison's re-election. They sent party regular John Milholland to meet with Frick.
Arriving in Pittsburgh, I learned that the Iron Master was in bed, still suffering severely from the effect of his wounds. Entirely courteous, Mr. Frick made it clear that even if Mr. Carnegie's consent was reinforced by the Cabinet, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, he, Frick, would not deviate one iota from the lines he had laid out to follow. His powerful jaws came together like a steel trap when he referred to the murderous exhibitions of the strikers. Yet, as he lay there, as white almost as the sheet itself, I realized that I was talking to a man of absolute nerve, with a will of iron, one who knew his own mind and indulged in no illusions as to the difficulties in the way of carrying out his purposes.
On August 3rd, Frick's newborn son died. A link between the battle and the infant's death formed in the public's mind. It brought sympathy to the grieving father, whose own life had been endangered. The Amalgamated denounced Berkman. Even before the assassination attempt, the Union had thrown several anarchists out of town for agitating among the strikers. Still, the public held the people of Homestead responsible for the shooting. O'Donnell feared the worst.
It would seem that the bullet from Berkman's pistol, failing in its foul intent, went straight through the heart of the Homestead strike.
The strikers were also facing a legal assault. The company had had warrants issued for McLucky, O'Donnell, and 5 other men, charging them with the murders of 2 Pinkerton guards during the battle on July 6th. McLucky, who had worked hard to keep Homestead sober, surrendered at the courthouse in a state of drunken bravado. He was locked up, and bail was set at $10,000, severely straining the Union's resources. By the end of October, 2,000 men were at work in the mill. 200 of them were former employees. In spite of continued support from across the nation, the unity of the forces at Homestead began to crumble. During the first week of November, many of the non-unionized mechanics deserted the Amalgamated. Winter was fast approaching, and a settlement seemed unlikely. Black workers, traditionally excluded from steelmaking at Homestead, were brought into the mill by company agents. Although they represented a small fraction of the non-union workforce, they were singled out for attack. Hundreds of townspeople vented their frustration in a vicious riot that ended with calls for lynching. On November 8th, Americans went to the polls and voted for the Democratic challenger, Grover Cleveland. As the Republicans had feared, President Harrison and his high tariff policy were defeated. On November 18th, Sylvester Critchlow became the first Homestead man to go to trial. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning its verdict. Not guilty. But the strikers' vindication came too late. While Critchlow sat on trial, 2,000 mechanics and laborers proposed that the union call an end to the strike. At first, the union men balked at the thought of giving in. But after 2 days of dispirited debate, many were convinced that holding out would be futile. By a narrow margin, they voted to end the strike.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Strike declared off yesterday. Our victory is now complete and most gratifying.
Life worth living again. The first happy morning since July.
The following day, over 2,000 strikers lined up at the mill gate. Only 406 were rehired. The strike organizers were barred from working in the mill, and the company circulated a blacklist that kept them out of the industry nationwide. O'Donnell became a reporter and moved to Chicago. Alexander Berkman spent 14 years in prison before rejoining the anarchist movement. He and Emma Goldman were deported to Russia in 1919. McLuckie remained a political organizer, but his work was sporadic and poorly paid. He eventually settled in Mexico and took a job on the Sonora Railway. By the close of 1892, the Amalgamated had lost its jurisdiction in all the Carnegie mills. A decade later, the Union had been driven from every major steel plant in the nation. Unionism in the steel industry had been crushed at Homestead. Before disbanding, the Homestead men issued this statement.
The most evident characteristic of our time and country is the control of each of our great national industries by one or a few men. It is a power which, though expressed as the right of employers to manage their business to suit themselves, is coming to mean nothing less than the right to manage the country to suit themselves.
In the year following the battle, 10 more states enacted laws banning the use of private armies. Businesses increasingly relied on state militias to quell their labor disputes. Long after his retirement, Frick continued to defend his role in the strike.
The demands of modern life called for such work as ours. And if we had not met the demands, others would have done so. Even without us, the steel industry of the country would have been just as great as it is, though men would have used other names in speaking of its leaders.
Homestead haunted Andrew Carnegie to the end of his days. He had built himself a reputation as a friend of the working man, but he could not wash his hands of the blood spilt on July 6th. He would return to Homestead in 1898 to present the town with a library. His employees, who worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, found little time to use it.
On the flats, close to the water's edge, there were masses of great sheds out of which grim smokestacks rose with a desolate effect. Higher up, the tenement houses stood in dingy rows, alternating with vacant lots. The sidewalks were sunken, swaying, full of holes. Everywhere the yellow mud of the street lay kneaded into a sticky mass, through which the groups of pale, lean men slouched in faded garments, grimy with the soot and grease of the mills.
This description of Homestead appeared less than 2 years after the strike. Another 4 decades would pass before the creation of industrial unions would substantially improve the lives of Homestead's workers.
But oh, it was awful that day at the Homestead, when the river ran red on its way to the sea, when brave men were falling and women were weeping, and riot was king of the land of the free.